Welcome, everybody. Last week, we began looking at a second type of art that was made in this interwar period. You know, we looked at all this constructivist stuff. And then last time we talked about Dada, which is really the essential foundation of irrational art, and talked about how that was linked to their response to the world they lived in, a world that looked insane to them, that seemed to have gone mad, and how sort of anger at institutions, whether it's the institution of art or political institutions or whatever, really were behind this. And it was largely a nihilistic movement. It was just about destroy this, everything's bad. It wasn't offering any positive sort of substitute for what art should be. It wasn't suggesting anything about art. And all that begins to change in the 20s. They really overlap quite a bit, as we will see. And it really leads into the surrealist movement. And some of the Dadaists move right into surrealism. Several of the people we're going to look at were doing sort of early Dada stuff, but moved quickly into surrealism. And while surrealism embraced the Dadaist conception of non-rationalism. In other words, they rejected rationalism in the same way. They don't do it nihilistically. It's not a destroy everything. It's really looking at the non-rational as opposed to the irrational, and we'll talk more about that. First of all, the term, which most people are familiar with, of surrealism or surreality, it is a French movement, or it begins in Paris. I'm not sure I'd call it a French movement because so many of the members weren't French. They just happened to be all in Paris. So the term is French, however, and if you know French, surreality is surréalité. Sur means above or on top of, so it means above reality or beyond reality, an alternate reality. Last time we looked at the sort of scuola metafisica, or the so-called metaphysical art of the Italian artist Di Chirico, and there's a similarity in terms of the labeling. You know, metaphysical doesn't mean exactly the same thing as surreal, but they are similar in the sense that both suggest that something is beyond the ordinary rational. And they're interested in that for a number of reasons. The surrealists want to really find that and tap into it. And much of their work, at least in the early years, was an exploration of what does that really mean? You know, what is surreality? How do I tap into that? But first of all, why do I want to tap into that? What's the point? What's wrong with just being rational all the time? Well, they really strongly believed that rationalism was limiting, that there are many ways to understand things, and a rational attempt is only one way, that there are other ways of knowing. There are things like intuition and instinct. These are ways of knowing, but they're not rational. Like, I instinctively know this is true, but I can't prove it to you rationally. We all know that that's a very important part of how many people believe the world works. They believe things that can't necessarily be proved rationally. That's pretty obvious. So maybe we should not be living in a totally rational world. Maybe we should, set that aside once in a while and try and think of other ways in which we can know things. So that's where it's coming from. Their goal was to search for surreality, find that. And the biggest influence on their methodology were the writings of Sigmund Freud. Freud's hugely important. Say a few things about Freud. Freud was working in the late 19th century writing. His most influential book, on dreams, interpretation of dreams, was published in 1900 in Vienna in German. And I think I mentioned this last time, that his biggest influence doesn't happen until after World War I. For one reason, most of his works were published or translated, I should say, into many different languages, including English, French, Russian, Italian, all the major languages in 21. So that, of course, had a huge impact. But another thing that most people don't know about Freud, because of the horrors of World War I and all of the people, vast numbers of people suffering from what they called shell shock, which we call post-traumatic stress, but they didn't understand it at the time. They for a long time, they just thought people were cowards and they would just execute anyone in World War I if you suffered from shell shock because you were a coward. But they began to recognize that when that war was over, the medical industry sort of came together and recognized that this was a real thing, that there's something going on here. And how do we treat millions of people who've come home from the war and they're suffering now from PTSD? And they knew that regular medical treatments didn't work. And this new science, this new medical division of psychology was just being born. And so after the war, they set up international commissions to study this from this new science. And Freud headed this up. This is where he really came to international fame, was right after World War I. And that, along with that, then his books are published. So Freud was known to people before his books were being published. In the newspaper, there's stories about this guy and this new science. So he's important. Now, so they all knew about him. So what was so important in Freud that drew them to him is some of the things that he suggested. Now, granted, Freud is totally out of favor and largely been disproven today, but nonetheless, there were things that ideas he introduced that were intriguing to many people, including artists. And one of them was the idea of the subconscious or unconscious mind. I mean, that was a new idea. People had assumed prior to this that we were rational beings. I mean, that's the essence of the Enlightenment, right? We're rational beings. So Freud's saying, no, you're not. No, you're not at all. Not only do you have this subconscious mind, but it governs what you do. Most of the time, you're acting from that. You're not rational beings. Now, this is a really interesting idea if you're talking with a bunch of artists. First of all, in the early 20th century, a bunch of artists who are searching for the source of creativity, right? This has been going on for 20 years. They were looking to primitive art and children's art and non-Western art. And then Freud comes along and says, why bother? It's right inside of you. Just look there. You want to find the source for creativity. It's in you. It's in everybody. So of course, artists are going to be just really drawn to that idea. And especially if you're rejecting rationalism and you want to look for something that's more sort of intuitive and instinctual. The fact that so much of Freud's writings are rooted in the concept of dreams and dream imagery, that is, of course, going to have a huge impact on them as well. Because basically, he says, this is the source. He interviews, every patient he's treating or he's working with, you talk about your dreams, because this is where, according to Freud, your subconscious mind is free, is released, and totally under no control of anything rational whatsoever. And everybody knows that. Everybody has dreams, and they don't make the tiniest bit of sense, and they're totally irrational, but they can sometimes be incredibly enlightening if you pay attention to them. Now, because these guys were now reading Freud, I can tell you from experience, when you read a lot of Freud, which I had to do for my own work, it does change your dreams. It does change your perception. You become more self-aware. Just reading Freud, just thinking about it, it triggers things. And I went through that phase where suddenly I had all these revelations all the time and all these things were connecting. And so there is a truth to that. This is what was happening to them as they were reading Freud and thinking about it. Freud also gave them a methodology, or I should say psychoanalysis, which is Freud's invention. and the term only relates to Freud or Freudian practitioners. So psychoanalysis was rooted in certain practices that Freud created to tap into people's subconscious. Things like, well, dream analysis is one, but he developed all sorts of other things like word association, where you say a word and then you answer really quickly, or automatic writing, where you just sort of write without thinking. He was looking for techniques that would bypass the conscious mind, that could trick the conscious mind or drop the conscious mind. The most important were things like Rorschach ink blot tests. I mean, that's a classic example of don't think about it, don't be logical, just what pops into your mind when you see this. So these are all techniques that artists can find equivalents for. Freud actually experimented briefly with hypnosis, but he abandoned it very quickly. But the Surrealists are going to play around with that as well. So they developed methods that would work for an artist as opposed to just Freud. And they came up with the idea that Andre Breton, I'll talk about him in a minute, referred to as convulsive imagery. And I'll define what that means in just a few moments. But briefly, it means images that shake up your mind, images that you go, what? It doesn't make any sense. It convulses your mind. They're going to be searching for things that are irrational, non-rational, but your mind briefly tries to make sense of them. This is all in an attempt to do what Breton referred to as dropping the barriers. They wanted to drop this barrier. Surrealism is not an attempt to depict the unconscious. It's an attempt to drop the barrier between the conscious and unconscious. It's one thing to say, I want to paint while I'm unconscious, but you can't paint while you're unconscious. You have to be conscious to paint. So they want you to drop the barrier so that you can tap into that while you're still conscious. So there'll often be references to dropping barriers, and that's what they mean, the barrier that's there. I mean, your mind has a real strong barrier. We'll talk about some of that in just a second. Andre Breton is the poet, the French poet, and it begins in literature, just as symbolist art did, just as so many things did. There were surrealist poets before there were visual artists, and he was the leader of the group from certainly by 22, he was the clear leader of the group, and then it had a lot of different poets and then visual artists as well. One of the phrases that is often repeated is a quote from a surrealist poet who wrote under the name Comte de l'Autrement. His real name was Isidore Ducasse, but he said that something was as beautiful as the chance meeting of a dissecting table and a sewing machine, as beautiful as the chance meeting on a dissecting table of a sewing machine and an umbrella. Now, as much as that is sort of it's not really a convulsive imagery because there's nothing irrational about it. You can have those things, perfectly rational. But on the other hand, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So what he's really saying is, I'm going to take this thing that's perfectly rational, and I'm going to take this thing that's perfectly rational, and I'm going to take this place, which is perfectly rational, and put them all three together. And together, none of them are perfectly rational. So that's a methodology. And what I'm really talking about is almost a kind of like collage sensibility. If I'm going to take this thing from this place and this thing from this place, and then I'm going to combine them in a new place that's not really right for either one. Now, that's a physical thing that you can get a hold of. I could do that. I know how to cut something out and paste something here and combine them. So there is an important quality there. There are other influences we'll talk about later. The influences, of course, symbolist art, because symbolist art in the late 19th century is about imagination. It's about rejecting of the real. So right away, they're continuing that idea of rejecting just art being what I see in my world around me. Dada, of course, for its embracing of the irrational, and the Scuola Metafisica for De Chirico's attempt to almost create these worlds, these suggestive and mystical worlds. So let's talk about that just a little bit more. One other analogy that one of the first artists makes is to alchemy. Now, alchemy is another metaphor that the surrealists, particularly Max Ernst, will rely on. Alchemy is a great many things. We could spend years talking about what alchemy was because it meant different things to different people. In its simplest form, it existed in the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance a bit, but mostly we think of it as medieval, as a sort of pseudoscientific attempt. Alchemists were trying to make turn lead into gold. But alchemy is so much more than that. It was a philosophical system. It's the beginning of real chemistry, where people were first experimenting with manipulating materials and changing things, combining different chemicals and things to make different things. But it was all tied to many other things. It's too complicated to go into alchemy. But alchemy is also very much related to the idea of combining of opposites, taking things that are two complete opposites and merging them. And that's what we're going to see. So as a metaphor for revelation, and I want to talk about that, the idea of surreality is that it can reveal something, some truth, some hidden truth. That's what alchemy was about. That was important to the symbolists, that there are truths out there that aren't always available on the surface. Now, this should sound familiar because it's very much related to everything else we've been talking about in the class. Even the constructivists, think of that Russian constructivism. They're embracing mystical icons because they were revelatory, because they could reveal some mystical truth. All of modernism is tied to this idea of revelation when you really think about it. There's so many different approaches to the modern world, but all of them were looking for a way to reveal something hidden, some truth about the world, some truth about the modern world they lived in. And this is simply another way of doing that. Convulsive imagery, I forgot to tell you about one of Breton's poems. You can do it with word, you can do it with image. You can have a verbal collage or you can have a visual collage. You can combine words just as you can combine images. Okay, so the title of one of his poems was Soluble Fish. I want you to think about that just for a minute. What is a soluble fish? Well, it's a paradox. You can't have a soluble fish. A fish can't dissolve in water, it won't be a fish. So that's a perfect that's a convulsive image, because just for a second, your mind is trying to make sense of that, because your mind says everything should make sense. So I got to make sense of this. But it can't. And for just a second, you drop that barrier. And for just a second, you have a peek into surreality. And I have seen over many long years, the response to that when people get it is to laugh. There's always people who are there's something funny about it. What you're experiencing, that laugh, is coming from that moment in which you allow that barrier to drop and you experience surreality and you experience the joy of it. People either love or hate surrealism, I've discovered, and it depends whether you can accept that you don't understand something and find joy in it, or whether you can't. It's that simple. If you're the kind of person that has to have an explanation for things, and you're not going to like this, because you're not going to get one. It's not a code. I'm not going to translate it for you. And if that's okay, then you'll like surrealism. I think it's joyful. Obviously, it's why I've worked on it my whole life. But I guarantee there are people get really mad when there's just some people who can't deal with it and they just don't like it. They won't have it. And if I don't tell them what it means, and I really just feel sorry for people that can't just sit back, drop the barrier and let it flow, and not, because then it's unending. You can enjoy it forever. Some art, we all know that there's a lot of art that's beautiful, but you get real tired of it real quick. There are things you want to look at on your wall, things you want to look at in the museum. You don't want to bring it home and look at it all day, every day. But to me, surrealism, I can look at, there are images I've seen for 30 or more years, and I'm still pulled in and compelled to look at this and look at that, and it's still there. It'll never close because it can't close because it's not rational. I don't want, if somebody would walk up and tell me, I know what that's really about, I would say, please do not tell me. I don't want this to be limited. And that's why limited, search for reality. Rationalism is limiting. Don't limit me with your rational world. I want to keep it open. So, forewarned. Max Ernst. Max Ernst is, in many ways, yes.
That painting that really gets me in the house, but that is Rico. Is that Rico?
Well, I think it kind of is. It kind of depends when he made it. I think we don't call him a surrealist because he was earlier, the group didn't exist. But what he's doing is pretty much exactly what they're going to be doing. And they know it. They embrace him. They see it. So I'm not bothered if people want to think of it as surrealism. Yeah, see, that's exactly. Yeah, me too. I love De Chirico. And,
who is she asking about?
Giorgio De Chirico, who we talked about last time, who did those strange scenes. He was a metaphysical painter, School of Metaphysica in Italy, and did those sort of strange buildings and shadows and odd forms. And they really were drawn to his work. So he's really, I think, one of the first to move in that direction. So De Chirico. Max Ernst, to me, is the first and purest of all the surrealists. He's my hero surrealist. He is was German, from Cologne, and he was in sort of 1919, 1920, he was part of a Dada group in Cologne, Germany, at the time. And I'll show you, this is one of his early works. Well, it's still referred to as Dada. You can see written across his face is Dada Max. And he actually is interesting. He's one of the first surrealists to embrace the mechanism of collage and understand its subversive potential. Now, we already saw that in Germany, Hannah Hoch, who was a Dadaist, was working with collage, and we looked at her collages last time. So he's really working under that same influence. However, he's not making political commentary. What I'm trying to say is Max Ernst's early work from 1920 and 21 are referred to as Dada. And then when he moves to Paris in 22, we begin calling it surrealism. That's always really bothered me. It drives me crazy because all of his work is surrealism. I don't care where he is. This is not Dada. There is a huge difference between Dada and surrealism, which to me is obvious, and it has to do with the intentions of the artist. This is not nihilistic or negative. He is from the beginning creating new worlds. He's creating things, and that's surrealism, not Dada. And it's not political. It's not that German political Dada. He's saying nothing about German culture. He's saying nothing about German society at all. And that's what the German Dadaists were doing. But, people will call this Dada. In fact, he writes Dada Max because he didn't know there was going to be a such thing as surrealism. So at the moment in time, he was part of the Dada circle. But what he's doing as we look back is actually looking forward rather than backward. So this is our Dada Max punching bag, the immortality of Cesare Buonarroti. And don't ask me who that is or what that means, because I have no idea. His collages that he began in 1919 are some of the more interesting things. This is a good example of a work that's generally referred to as Dada, but is not. It's pure surrealism. When he was still living in Cologne, he was going through, I don't know why or how, but he was going through this old school that had been shut down, like a public school, and he found just stacks and stacks of magazines and sales magazines that sold supplies to schools, and particularly for science programs. If you can imagine, remember when you were in science classes, whatever, you had, there would be like slides and images of these different like cell formations and just odd little scientific things. He found books that had all these images of these odd little organic like things, and they just fascinated with them. Also, like mechanisms, tools, and things that would be used in a science lab. And he started making collages out of them. And this is one, the Graminius bicycle. Titles like this are interesting because this clearly comes from the catalog. I looked it up because I didn't know what Graminius meant. It's a reference. It's a botanical reference. It's a reference to it's a property that is held by certain kind of grasses. Are Graminius? I don't really, and it's something to do with the shape of the blade. It's a scientific term. So, he's borrowing that from the catalog. I don't know what these are. They certainly look scientific to me, though. They look like little cells or amoebas or I don't know, something. But the way he's putting them together is creating references. They're like little living things. They're like little aliens or strange little worlds. One of them looks like he's flying. They look like they're bodies. They're little things down here that look like flagella. And don't ask me how I remember that word, but some science class, back there, that word stuck, but I know it means these little things that float around. Anyway, but then he's made them mechanical. He's turned it into like a gear. And then these little strange things that seem to shape a space. I could look at this forever. It's just interesting. I don't know what it is, but it's suggesting of another reality, another world. He didn't work, well, he is going to work automatically in just a moment. When the Surrealist Manifesto is published in 1924, which was written by André Breton, that really sort of brought together all of the people that were in Paris at that time. And in that, he talked about the importance of automatism and psychic automatism. Automatism simply means doing something automatically, right? It's just a general term. Psychic automatism is a term they use to refer to something you do automatically by tapping into your psyche. My example of that, and you all do it, we all do, is I don't anymore because we have cell phones now. But back in the day when we had landlines and when you talked on the phone, you had to stay in one place and you had a notepad next to your phone. I always had this habit of doodling when I was talking on the phone. And I would be having a conversation here and doing or drawing or writing, and I would get off the phone and look, and I had no memory of doing that whatsoever. Sometimes I wrote something down, sometimes I drew a picture, but what was happening was I'd split my mind, and my conscious mind was on the phone talking, and my unconscious mind was doing something with my hand. I mean, we do that. There are other times when you're in touch with conscious and unconscious, and that is as you're falling asleep and as you're waking up. There are often moments when you're half and half, when you're kind of aware you're in bed, but you're halfway into a dream, or you wake up and you know where you are and what's going on, but that dream is still floating. It doesn't last long at all. It's just a split second. But those are the moments that they're searching for to access. So psychic automatism meant a lot of things. It could mean automatic drawing. It could mean anything that triggers the subconscious. He experimented with a lot of different techniques, and this one is a frottage. Frottage is a rubbing. This is a rubbing. In this case, is canvas, where you lay something down, over something with texture. Usually we think of it with paper over something textured, and then you rub it, and it picks up these random mark making. And then you look at it, and then you allow it to suggest something to you, and then you go in and paint over it. So it's not just random and accidental. He has drawn and painted over it. He has turned this into a landscape. Many of his images, many of his frottages and automatic work end up being landscape. Someone else could do a rubbing on the same surface and end up with a totally different kind of thing. It's your own subconscious you're tapping into. It's really part of a very Germanic tradition of sort of the dark forest and the fairy tale thing. You know, he's German and he comes out of that literary tradition, and it does seem to inform a lot of his works. Also, there is a lot of subconscious mind that can be dark. And when you delve into that, you don't know what you're going to find. And in this case, there's sort of a darkness to it, a mysterious quality. You know, he's added these circular forms. He's added other things to it. I think his greatest works were two different works that he did as collage novels. And the collage novels are really unique in art. And, you know, when I retired, I gave away almost all of my books on Western art. I had hundreds and hundreds of them, and I just gave them to students, all of them. I kept my Asian art books, but I gave away all the Western art because I thought, I'm never going to teach again. I'm never going to want those books. And the only ones I regret deeply are giving away my copies of these two collage novels. They were just reprints, of course, but only place I could find them in print. They're like really expensive now. So I'm real upset that I didn't keep those. Anyway, what they are like books, literally about, you know, the size of a novel, and each page is a collage, and they're organized around certain themes. You could spend a you could spend a lifetime looking at just one collage novel. And I think the best one is the first one. Just look at the pages over and over, and you start to think you figured out what's connecting, and then something else happens and it breaks the pattern. It's just trying to solve the puzzle is the fun of it. The title to this one, first one, is La Femme sans tête, which is a play on words. It's a play on the pronunciation again, just sort of like Duchamp's, L-H-O-O-Q. It's a play on the word cent, which in French, if I just say cent out of context, I could be saying C-E-N-T, which means 100, or I could be saying S-A-N-S, which is also pronounced sans, which means without. So when you say this in French, La Femme sans tête, you don't know whether I'm saying both the woman with 100 heads and the headless woman. Now that's again an oxymoron. That's a convulsive image. That's a paradox. She can't be headless and have 100 heads. Now, when it's translated into English, it loses that because we translate it as the 100 headless woman, which, you know, given, you know, you're kind of translating it, but it doesn't have the impact as the French title does. He really understood the disruptive nature of collage here. He's using now, he liked a lot of Victorian images. A lot of his images look very Victorian that he cuts out. They sort of look very old-fashioned to us. They actually looked pretty old-fashioned in the 1920s. These are magazines from the 19th century. So even then, they looked sort of out of time, out of place. Now, something like this, I could go on about this image for a million years. It's so mystical. I love this. It's my favorite image in my favorite collage novel by my favorite artist. So I guess this is my favorite surrealist piece. There's something about it that's very futuristic. It taps into the 20s city of the future. It's sort of machine-like. There's something in it that's strangely, you know, oddly symmetrical and balanced. You've got this strange woman, this nude woman. What's she doing down there? There's something ominous about it. There's something vaguely sexual about it, but not really. You've got the little tiny guy over on the left. What's he doing there? That throws off the whole perspective. I cannot look at it without seeing The Wizard of Oz, and I'm not really sure why. It's like when the curtain's drawn back and you've got the wizard back there with his machines or whatever. Something reminds me of that. Something below in this lower section that looks like architecture in buildings. Is it a machine? It's a merging of the sort of geometric and the organic, with her thrown in there. It changes. It would be totally different if she weren't there. It wouldn't have anywhere near the power, but it's this combining of all these futuristic, bizarre images. How does it strike you guys? Or does it? Organ pipes, yes. I mean, I think that's perhaps the Wizard of Oz thing, because doesn't he have like things that remind me of organ? That's just me. Never mind. I probably totally confused on the Wizard of Oz, but anyway, yeah, they do. There's organ pipes. It does look like maybe that's an organ, but there's not really a keyboard. There's no answer. It's not a code. It can't be translated. It's something that you're meant to just let your mind go. Some of them are quite humorous. Let me present the uncle whose beard we like to tickle on Sunday afternoons. Now, my students can't see anything except the headset. They see it as a headset. I think what they are is blinders. I think they're old-fashioned sort of blinders that those are meant to go out on the side. I guarantee it's not a headset. But again, it's that old-fashioned looking 19th century figure with the.
Oh, okay. Thank you for calling. I'm calling Rhodes Scholar too until they get back to you.
Can I ask you to mute your computer? Thank you. This strangely cropped body.
Fine. So, and
excuse me.
I had another question for her, but
Oh,
you're
wait,
on the
wait.
line. The fridges in the rooms, or in the one in that room, I guess at this point.
Wait,
Do
can
they
you
have
hear
a tiny freezer unit? We're driving
you
both
can't
to
hear me.
and from
hear
several
me.
days and running up to Ann Arbor, so from Kansas. So
Hello.
we'll have food in the car.
Can you mute your computer, please?
Mm-hmm.
No, she can't hear me.
It'd just be blue ice or something like that then probably. So yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for putting Rhodes Scholar in ahead of your schedule. Bye-bye.
Okay, can everybody hear me now?
Well, 10 days away. We're on the 8th. So yeah.
I think it's Carol.
Yeah. It all muddles together.
Carol.
Thank you.
Carol, can you hear me? Hello, out there. Carol, can you hear me? Oh, if Carol can hear me, can you ask her please to mute her computer? Whatever. Anyway, we can see the juxtaposition in here of what causes the discomfort. Because, then you think of, ooh, somebody's rubbing their beard, but it's this naked body, and there's all sorts of link. Now, pardon me. No, it's not a header number in here. I was going to text her, but I don't. Okay. So, Carol, if you can hear me now, please mute your computer.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know when that happened.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let's move on. The second collage novel was titled Une Semaine de Bonté, or Week of Kindnesses. It's different. To me, it's not as humorous, it's darker. The reference to a week of kindnesses, within the title, there isn't really a paradox, but it's a paradox between what you see, because the images are really kind of dark and they're anything but kindness. So, but it's also a little more constructed. It's more directly connected to alchemy. There have been some interesting work done on it that linked, he set up certain chapters that are related to chemical elements and different colors, and really delving deep into the world of alchemy, and the symbolism of alchemy plays out in this piece. This is one of the first places where we see Lop Lop. Lop Lop is a character that he created. It's defined as the bird superior, or the superior of the birds. And we see these strange bird people and bird characters in many, many of his works. And he really does, and he really does talk about it later. He understands where this obsession with birds comes from. This, again, what happens with the surrealists when you're thinking about Freud and your dreams and everything else is when he was little, he had a sister. And the same day his sister was born was the day that his pet bird died. And for some reason, as a child, he merged those two things psychologically merged in his mind. And birds took on the powers of life and death in a way. It's a subconscious thing. It took him a long time before he understood why he was so obsessed. There's a lot of personally obsessive imagery in surrealism. And sometimes the artists know the source of it, and sometimes they don't. You know, just because we don't understand it doesn't mean they do. I mean, they don't always understand what they do either, but he does come to understand, and birds become these sort of ominous, threatening, powerful things, especially when they merge with man. When you're combining two animals like this, that's also a symbol of this merging of opposites. A surrealist journal from the period was titled Minotaur. Minotaur was a surrealist journal published in the 1930s. Now, they embraced the Minotaur as a symbol because the Minotaur is this half bull, half man. It's one of the ultimate symbols of merging of opposites. The Minotaur was born through the unnatural merging of a woman and a bull in Greek mythology, and she gave birth to the Minotaur. So Minotaur, they're embracing that, and we'll see other sort of forms that they're embraced at all. Now here, this is very De Chirico-like in the sense that it's ominous and threatening without specifically saying why. There's just something about it that is threatening. The people seem to be in a hurry. You've got the oversized figure. The hand, I'm not sure, but it seems to be holding possibly a feather in a pair of tweezers, is what it looks like to me.
I would say that's the alchemy part of it. It could be like a petri dish with.
Okay. That's another way, a scientific way of seeing.
What did she say?
That she related it to alchemy, that it could be like a petri dish. Like I saw it as tweezers, but you could see it as just a little dish too, and something in it. See, that's the thing. There's no right or wrong. And then I want to know, what are those ships in the background? You know, what is that for? Yeah, you don't notice them. You really don't notice them because your eye comes down here. But as you look around, there's just weird things going on. And of course, playing with proportion and of the forms is an important part of it as well. In 1939, Europe largely emptied of artists as they all fled when World War II began, many in New York. And during World War II, most of the surrealists were in New York. They were quite a presence there, being fairly loud and making their presence known. Ernst was there as well. And he made this is decalcomania. Decalcomania is a different automatistic technique. Decalcomania is where you take two surfaces, in this case, one of them is a canvas, and you keep the paint really thick, and you randomly place it on one, and then you lay the other canvas over it. And then when you pull them apart, there's a sticky quality. I think you can see the technique here. It just looks like you pulled two materials apart, and then you have this sort of paint that's left on the surface in a sticky way. So it's not a rubbing. If you've never tried that, try it. Just put paint together. When you lift it, it pulls apart and it leaves this sticky surface. And then he goes in and works with it and turns it into something. Of course, it's another landscape. And in this one, he titles it Europe After the Rain. So this is one of his only works, not the only one I could think of, but I hate to say that, one of his only works that directly references something that's actually happening in the world. This seems to be a direct reference to World War II. And, you know, the devastation of Europe, it's right in the middle of the war. And he calls it Europe After the rain being the war. So it's surrealist, and yet he's also using the surrealist image as a metaphor for something that is happening in the world, which really takes it out of surrealism technically. But that's just, the title does it more than anything else. If he hadn't put the title there, fine, no connection, but the title is what connects it. Here's another version of Lop Lop. Here we get our bird man figure. Here you can see some of these wonderful details. I just love, you know, to paint this would have taken, you couldn't paint this. I mean, the detail of trying to do this, and you wouldn't think to do it. It all just happened automatically by pressing the paint together and pulling it apart. I just think it's brilliant surface. It's a magnificent surface, but he's turned it into like little structures and little buildings, and you can't see it. Let me back it up again. Somewhere over here, there are other little figures. There's some little figures in a sort of cave down here that are hard to see. This appears to be sort of a partial figure with its back turned. Lots of little details happening. Yeah, there's the figures on the left. I forgot I have those in there. You can see them, cave-like figures. This is something you could look at forever because you know, inch by inch, there's something interesting to look at. And then we have, of course, the beautiful large piece of the Nelson. He actually stayed in America, moved to Arizona, and really spent much of the rest of his life there. We'll talk a bit more about that when we get to the work of his wife, who we'll look at a little later. Man and woman, if you know, this is right in the entryway when you walk in. I'm sure you've all seen this. It's quite large. It's titled Capricorn, and I'm not quite sure why, because I don't know anything about Capricorn. But it's man and woman, minotaur and mermaid is how he described it. Again, symbols of this union of opposites. Each one is a union of opposites. The minotaur, the mermaid, of course, half woman and half fish, and then the two of them together form another union of opposites. But it's a really interesting piece to look at. And now that you've got somewhat of a context for it as to how he's merging these forms, check it out again. It's interesting. I love this strange like fish that's going through her head. She seems to have the body of a woman, but the strange, don't be so literal. And the child, I want to go back in and look at that child again and see what the heck is that made out of? Because that's going to be bull, man, woman, fish. You know, it's a bull, man, woman, fish. Okay, let's look at another one of our surrealists, one who is really quite interesting. He was part of the group, but he was really kind of on the outside. They actually used to make fun of Miro once in a while, and they weren't very nice. Well, the surrealists weren't very nice people, full stop, to a great extent. First of all, politically, they were mostly all united politically. They were all communists. They were all, but then so were most artists in the 20s. Everybody was a communist. Because the communists were the only ones. Well, first of all, they all thought the Soviet Union was working, and it wasn't. But Also, the communists at that time were the only anti-fascists. And more than anything, they were anti-fascist because fascism was rising by the mid-20s. And so people jumped on the communist bandwagon in the mid-20s. That's why, when McCarthy has his hearings and he asks, are you now or have you ever been a communist? So many people were forced to admit, they proved that they were. And it doesn't mean anything. It's because everybody was a communist in the 20s. If you were an anti-fascist, you were either fascist or communist. That was it. Or you were totally apolitical. And all of them were except one, not Moreau. He was an anti-fascist, but he's Spanish. He came to Paris sort of late and began, by 24, came to Paris. He was a bit of an outsider because he had a family. He was the only one that was married, had children. He was a family man. And the other guys were, just free living, they had mistresses or whatever. And they kind of sometimes made fun of Moreau. He was a little bit more conservative than they were. And that's all they needed. And Breton loved having the power to say who was in and who was out. And he liked using that power. But I feel sorry for Moreau sometimes because I really love him. And it turns out after World War II, he is the most influential of almost all of them. His work's very influential. You'll see his murals and things all over. Chicago has some beautiful public pieces of these big walls of Moreau. So he really has an impact. One of his early pieces. This is, when, he finally is sort of embraced by them. Harlequin's Carnival is one of a series of sort of Dutch-related pieces. Moreau's work is not trying to tap into the subconscious. He's very consciously inventing a world. There's something really playful about Moreau and something sort of childlike about Moreau in a way that the others aren't. Surrealism was a grouping of people who had similar goals, but it's not a style. Everyone works in different ways, in different media, but they're all interested in the same thing. And Moreau is working more intently, but they're far more playful and far more fun. And he is more influenced, I think, by some of the constructivist ideals that are happening as well, because he does deal with planes more and he deals with space more. He is more interested in that. I mean, this is another thing you could look at forever. The reference to Harlequins, of course, is from the Commedia dell'arte, the Harlequin figures that you see here. You see it in the colors and the playfulness. You begin to see, as you look at it more, figures. This is a figure, this guy back here, or this woman back here, I don't know what it is. You can see the feet. There are little figures, hanging off the ladder. There's a little cat down here playing with his yarn. There are some insects over here, not sure what they're up to, other little figures. So it's very inventive, creating new worlds, very playful. I can really see why he was popular. He was the most popular because I think anybody can relate to something this fun and this playful. There are a few dark pieces that he does, some of them a bit darker. Personnages rythmiques, or basically people dancing, where you still see the playful invention of these forms, but at the same time, it's very flat. You see the solid color planes, the color fields, and it's very reminiscent of some of the constructivist art, but also very reminiscent of someone like Alexander Calder, who we're going to look at later in the class when we look back at some American artists. But Calder is working with the same sort of plane. Cut this out and hang them up, you have a Calder mobile. I mean, it's very similar sorts of forms that he's working with. And it is Juan Miró. This is the one in the Nelson from 46. By this time, again, as time goes on and in people's later work, other influences come into play. So in 46, he does this. This is our little example. It's a really nice example of a Miró. I really do like that piece as well. Man, I'm fascinated with between Max Ernst and Magritte. These are like two very, very different voices, but they both speak of two powerful types or approaches to surrealism. Magritte was part of a Belgian group, and there were a Belgian group of surrealists. They come along a little bit later, and they're quite different from the French. They're less experimental. They're far more intellectual. They're much more involved in word play in an intellectual way. I have a quote here from Magritte. He says, "To equate my painting with symbolism, conscious or unconscious, is to ignore its true nature. People who look for symbolic meanings fail to grasp the inherent poetry and mystery of the image. By asking, what does it mean? They express a wish that everything be understandable. But if one does not reject the mystery, one has quite a different response." And I love that statement. And his work is perfect for that. Now, there are certain things that affect Magritte's work as well, certain traumas, and let's face it, I don't see how anybody reaches the age of 21 without having been traumatized somehow. I mean, I think everybody, being a child, is traumatic in its own way. But when he was 14, his mother committed suicide. She drowned herself in a lake or a river, or whatever, and he found her body. She was in her nightgown, and when he found her, it had floated up and was covering her head. If you can imagine a 14-year-old boy finding his mother's body half naked and the upper half of her body is covered, and you see this throughout his imagery, there's no question that this has an impact on him. Magritte and the Belgians in general were very, very skeptical people. They had a very ironic eye. They lived very middle-class lives and critiqued the world from that point of view. The Parisians were bohemians, and they lived outside of a middle-class environment, etc. But these guys are different. They're far more educated. They're more like gentlemen, and yet their eye is a very different one. When you see something like this, The Lovers from 1928, you see right away this impact of this sort of fabric covering the face. There's something very disturbing and ominous in works like these. His technique is one that's very similar to what Dali does, which we'll see in a minute, is to paint with a kind of almost super realist touch. There's no brushwork here. It's not painterly in any way. It's smooth and slick, so that in details, it looks like it's very realistic, or what we would call naturalistic. But when you pull back and look at the whole picture, there's nothing realistic about it at all. It doesn't make any sense, but it lures you in. I mean, Dali's the best at that, actually, by painting sort of this perfect little thing. I mean, that piece of draped cloth over the face is done perfectly realistically, but the scene as a whole is not. It doesn't make sense. He wouldn't have seen this, hopefully, but it's very disturbing statements that it suggests. The ones that we're more familiar about are the ones that are sort of less straightforward. I think the previous one was a bit straightforward in terms of how you might interpret it if you wanted to. Titles become really important in surrealist art in general, because they're another language. And this is something that Magritte is involved in. Today, we really recognize Magritte for a lot more than we did 30, 40 years ago, even, because we have changed. We live in a world where there are a lot more important philosophies that are shaping our world, particularly dealing with linguistics. There are post-World War II philosophers, Wittgenstein and others, who really developed some kinds of linguistic philosophy that begin to really look at language in a different way, to think about how our language constructs our world and how we frame our world through language. And that study has found its way into things like not only linguistic studies, but philosophies of structuralism and post-structuralism, which I'm not going to get into. They're postmodern. They don't really have anything to do with the modern world. However, some of those linguistic studies were beginning in this interwar period. And Magritte begins in his own art to deal with language in new and interesting ways. One of the things that this new linguistic studies looks at is this relationship between different languages, that when we live in our world, we actually interact with the world through multiple languages at the same time. We have visual languages, we have verbal languages, we have auditory languages, but not only that, but within visual languages, there's the language of color and there's a language of shape. There's a language that we speak, there's a language that we write. And postmodern philosophies look at this idea of language in terms of it often being conflicting. Like, we already know that, we get conflicting information all the time. We live in a world where we're constantly, this person says this is true, this person says that is true. Or when you listen to the news, you see this picture, but someone tells you this happened. But the picture is contradicting the words that someone says. These are conflicting information. And more than anything, people see this as defining the world we live in today in a really unique way. That's a whole different kind of philosophy that I don't really want to get into much. But Magritte is beginning to deal with that idea of conflicting language. And if everything is conflicting, how are we supposed to make sense of the world we live in? That's a very postmodern idea. Now we're getting interesting messages here. We're getting multiple visual languages and verbal language, multiple verbal languages, actually, as well, when you think about it. First of all, on one level, you have the eye, someone looking into it. We immediately think of, right, the eye is the window to the soul, right? I think Leonardo da Vinci said that. But that's not what's going on. So on the one hand, that's a bit of information that we get from this. So are we looking into our soul? Is that what he's saying here? Or is that what we're meant to see? But what we see in it is clouds. We're not looking into us. We're actually looking out of us, right? We're not looking in, we're looking out. So is this our eye? And we're looking out our eye at the world and we see these clouds. Now the title, False Mirror. First of all, mirror, where's that come from? Because how are we supposed to read this as a mirror? Because it doesn't look like a mirror. It looks like we're looking through a window. Now, a mirror is different from a window. Does this mean it's reflecting back at us? False mirror, what does that mean? It's not true. What's not true? What's false? This is a very complicated image. If you sit and think about the information he's giving us. Now, I'm not saying we need to decode it. I'm just saying see all the levels and the complexity of what he's saying here about how we interact with the world.
How big is that?
None of his are really big. I don't have the dimensions on this, but it's not huge. Surrealist work in general are not big. They're generally, around that size or smaller. Some of them are tiny. The very famous one. Let's talk about this, because this is often misunderstood. First of all, the title is not, This Is Not a Pipe. The title is The Treachery of Images. That's important. It's written on the canvas, This Is Not a Pipe. Now, the most common and simplest surface level interpretation is, and I still read everywhere, everyone says, he's saying, no, it's not a pipe, it's a picture of a pipe. But that actually doesn't really make any sense, because that idea that I mean, did you think it was an actual pipe? I didn't. I mean, I kind of knew it was a picture. There's not really much of a point. It actually might have made sense in the 19th century, because there was a period in the 19th century, particularly in the 80s, where this idea that paintings were things in their own right, that a painting was a thing. It wasn't just what it represented. This is when art for art's sake began. This idea of this is a painting in its own right. It exists for its own sake, not just for this person that's depicted in it or whatever. So I could see as a 19th century idea, someone reiterating that this isn't a pipe, it's a thing in its own right. But that's not something you would say in 1928, 29. That idea makes no sense. So given that, how are we supposed to interpret the treachery of images? This is where, first of all, I also want to point out, he's writing those words on the canvas. Nobody's done, well, I'm not going to say nobody's done that. We have seen text on a canvas. Anybody remember where? Cubism. Remember some of those analytic cubist works, there were words, sometimes maybe a newspaper clipping, but also sometimes just painted words. But those words were intentional references to the real world, the physical world. They were meant to look like printing, like newspaper print. And they were primarily put there spatially. They were put there for formal reasons, to identify the picture plane, or because of the space in relation to the planes that we talked about at the time. This is not. This is put there so you'll read it. It's the words that matter. So clearly the imagery of the words is important. Words are image. Now, this is one reason why artists don't sign the front of paintings anymore. I've had people ask, why don't artists write their names? Because the minute you write your name on the front, it becomes an image. It's part of the image. It's not separate from the image. It's part of the painting. So, put your name on the back. So he's not putting it on the back. He's putting it very prominent. So if we think of the words as an image, just like the pipe is an image, we're getting two languages. One is a visual language, one's a verbal language. And they contradict one another. The words below say this is not a pipe. The image above says pipe. Now, it can't be pipe and not pipe. We're back to your soluble fish analogy again. He's playing with language. He's juxtaposing contradicting languages here of not pipe, 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 not pipe. That's what he's really doing. And I find that far more interesting than saying it's not a pipe, it's a picture of a pipe. Treachery of images. What a title. He's showing you how dangerous language is. And when he says image, he means the image of the words and the image of the pipe. And they're treacherous because they can contradict one another. They're paradoxical. So you can see how he's tied to what the French were doing in surrealism, juxtaposing two different things that contradict one another, but he's doing it in a very intellectual way. This is philosophy. This is art as philosophy, surrealism as philosophy, linguistic study, not surrealism as psychic automatism. This is this is deeply intentional. And that's why images are treacherous. He shows us more about treacherous images in a moment. This is one of my favorite elective affinities. You can see it's small, 16 by 13 inches, fairly typical. The title comes from a book by Goethe. So, I mean, this is a smart guy. He knows philosophers, he knows writers. And elective affinities is actually a scientific term from chemistry, and it refers to things that have an affinity for one another, that are just sort of pulled together. There are some sort of chemicals that have a certain elective affinity that are just drawn together and merge. So that's sort of the reference. So the term makes sense in the context of surrealism, where they're pulling things together. I love this image. He said he had a dream. He woke up one morning and he looked, and he had like a bird in a cage, but for a minute he looked at the bird, and it's a white bird. For a minute it looked like an egg. So, but I love the idea of, this elected affinities between egg, bird, cage. You've got cage and egg, which make no sense, but the minute you throw in bird, they make sense. They've come together now. So bird and cage is fine. Egg and bird is fine, but he skipped the middle one and just went egg, cage. And again, it's playing with meaning and taking layers of meaning and combining them. So the poor little bird's going to be born in a cage. The human condition is, again, you could take off from these and go on for hours. Two versions of it. These are two different paintings, one on the left and one on the right. They're similar in some ways. We've got a painting on an easel in front of a window, and reality merges from our point of view. The it's like the other one. The painting is interesting, but it's the title that takes me somewhere. The human condition. So what's he saying about the human condition? And is he saying something about our ability to recognize reality? Like, because you lose reality here. When you look at it, you lose it. You lose what's canvas, what's out the window. Or is the window just another canvas? Is the whole thing just the background? And you lose that. So is that our human condition? Never knowing what's real, never knowing what's... Are you familiar with the latest philosophical dialogue that's going on? It fascinates me. Is the, how do we know we're not living in a digital simulation? I got like 2 whole books on the subject I just bought that I'm reading. It's so interesting. How do you know? How do we know? And it's had, that whole philosophy has had some terrible results from... Go into that another time if anybody's interested. But it's like, it reminded me of it. The idea of, is that the human condition? Is sort of that we're limited to our one body and our one point of view, and that all we can ever know of reality is what we experience. I mean, how do I know what you experience? How do I know what you see? That's my human condition, is I can't ever know. So it's something like that. Again, it's raising an issue. I don't know what this, I mean, the one on the right is the most disturbing in some ways, because if this is the beach, what is this room with the arch? The arch reminds me of De Chirico too, because he has all those buildings with the arches. But what is this thing? I'm not sure what that it looks more like a cannonball than anything else. I have no idea when bowling balls were first made or how old bowling is. Not a clue. Whatever it is, I don't know. So that's the human condition. And then also one of my favorites, I mean, they're all my favorites. How can you not have a favorite of Magritte? I mean, he's incredible. Golconda. Golconda is a city in India. And it was kind of a ruined or abandoned city in India. There were a number of different kingdoms that ruled it, and it was destroyed by war. What that's got to do with anything, I'm not sure, but he chose that name for a reason. We have this middle-class neighborhood, and the middle-class guy, and the bowler hat, of course, symbolized middle class for him, and all these guys. So they're absolutely frozen. So they're like raindrops. Are they? It's raining men. That I've heard people come up. It's rain. It's literally raining men. But they could be going up too, because they're totally frozen, and you can't see whether they're going up or down. They're just right there. What an image! I mean, I think that's why I'm so enamored of the surrealists. Is I'm absolutely in love with their minds. That I'm always attracted to the great mind. You know, who has a mind like this? Why couldn't I think of something like that? So I don't have an answer, just something to look at that you just want to keep looking at. And of course, the ones people are familiar with, lastly, we have to look at those. Son of Man, Man with a Bowler Hat. He does a bunch of these. Sorry, I'm not going to interpret these. I've got nothing for you here. He's covering the face. They're ordinary things. The bowler hat is really the most prominent. The titles, you know, the Man with the Bowler Hat is probably the least interesting title ever. Son of Man is an interesting title because what the heck does that mean? So that's suggestive. Almost of another world again, or something outside our ordinary experience. Is there some religious reference in these, which I think
Yes, that's what they call Jesus.
son of, no, we're son of God. Is he
Son of
called
Man.
son of man?
Jesus was son of man.
Oh,
But it's in the Bible all over.
oh,
You should have been.
I just
You should have been a Baptist.
yeah, no. But I've been having this class with Kendall for years, and we went through the whole New Testament, Old Testament, and everything else. And I don't remember seeing that. Well, it makes sense because the one on the right clearly does, because the dove is always a symbol of the Holy Spirit. So there does seem to be religious context. So once we agree on that, now it ges really difficult. What does that mean? You know, where does that come from? So, you know, don't have an answer to that either.
In front of his face.
What?
What's that in front of his face on this one? The Son of Man.
The apple. It's an apple, the green apple. He's done many versions of this. You've probably seen other paintings with the apple in his face. He does other versions of things in front of people's faces, other things floating in the clouds. But he's affected, I haven't seen any for a while, but you used to see a lot of ads or commercials that had influence from his pieces. Haven't seen any for a while. But people are very interested in him right now. Dali. The best known in America, and there's a reason why Americans know Dali, because he spent a lot of time here and got a lot of publicity here. He's not nearly that famous in Europe. I have mixed feelings about Salvador Dali. Some of his art I like, some of the early work, not the later religious stuff. I hate that. But I have really bad feelings about him as a man. And I have a hard time forgetting things. And when I said that the surrealists were all socialists or mostly socialists, Dali was actually a fascist, and he was a supporter of Franco during the Spanish Civil War. They actually kicked him out of the group for that reason. They made a quite elaborate ceremony, kicked him out. And it's always hard for me to forget that, even though I'm supposed to forget that. I'm a human being and I can't forget that. He had, he's also just not as important in the movement as people tend to think he is. He doesn't even come along until 1930. He missed the whole first 10 years of surrealism. So he sort of comes along late. He's not part of that early group. But I don't want to, totally dismiss the man. He has some important works. These are the things we mostly think about when we think of Dali: Persistence of Memory, which is a very small painting. It's at Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I will never forget the first time I was there and I was sort of looking for it. And I think I walked by it like a dozen times because in my head, it was big. It should have been bigger. And it's suddenly like on the fourth time past that I went, that's it? That's it. And it was somewhat disappointing for me. I don't know why, but it's just this little thing. And Dali's the only one with an ego big enough to write 2 autobiographies, and he does talk about in them. He talks about a lot of his imagery and where it comes from and why. So melting things and clocks and especially the insects. These are like little ants on this. He talked. If you've ever seen his film, The Chien Andalou, Andalusian Dog, if you're familiar with that, it's one of the most famous experimental sort of surrealist films. A lot of these people made films. This another whole course is films of the early century. But Un Chien Andalou, or the Andalusian Dog, is probably the most famous early 20th century film. And it is, I always used to show it in class because we had a copy. I'm sure, without a doubt, it's on YouTube. You can look it up and watch it. It's maybe 10 minutes or so. It's just bizarre imagery, but I can't believe you haven't heard of it. It's the scene where there's the eyeball. Everybody knows that. You don't know the eyeball scene? Well, I'm not going to tell you. Go watch it. It looks like a human eyeball is being cut with a razor. It's not, but it's not. But it's unbelievably creepy, even when you've seen it a dozen times and you know that it's not. It's still creepy. And there's another scene where this guy, where ants start crawling out of a hole in somebody's hand. It's just full of layers of surrealist images, all of which you can relate back. That's Dolly's film. His methodology is, he called it paranoid critical. What he called paranoid critical method, which, it doesn't actually make any sense, so don't worry about why he called it that. He says it's the ability to see more than one level simultaneously. So 2 worlds, that's supposed to say at once. I don't know, not at onk. 2 worlds at once. And when you look at his works, forms sort of flip back and forth. So on the one hand, you see one thing, rocks or whatever, or a hand, and then suddenly it's something else. That's the most common part of his work. And he was very, very good at it. So the egg that's cracking, these are like rocks, but then it's a hand. This is like, yeah, you could spend a lot of time with this. His work in the 30s is his best work and his most interesting work as well, like The Great Paranoiac, again, where you see the face. Now do you see the body, the back of a man here? Can you see both? Who sees the face? The head. Now who sees the body, the back of the man here? Can't see him? Seriously? Here's the head. Here's his shoulders. You're seeing him sort of from the back, and his head is down like that. Here's his rear end, and his legs just kind of down here in shadow. Have we got it? Yeah. And if you keep looking other ways, you begin to see he was very, very good at that. He was very, very good at doing things 2 ways. Paranoid critical. I'd rather look at some women now. Women of surrealism. And there were a lot of them, even though they were largely on the fringes. They were never welcome. They were never allowed in to the group. And I have 5 of them. I don't want to spend much time on them, just sort of look at them briefly and tell you who they are. Dorothea Tanning, who's from Galesburg, Illinois, just like right down the road from where I grew up in Illinois. But she moved to New York in the 30s, saw an exhibition. There was a really groundbreaking exhibition in 1936 at the Museum of Modern Art, curated by Alfred Barr, who was the first director of that museum. It was called Fantastic Art, Dada, and Surrealism. Really important in 1936. And she saw that, and it was just, blown away by that. It had a profound effect on her. She went to Paris in 1939, but when she got there, she'd found out that all the artists just left and come back to New York. So she went back to New York and met several of the surrealists there in New York. when she met Max Ernst when he was selecting works for an exhibition by 31 women organized by Peggy Guggenheim. Peggy Guggenheim was one of these really important figures in New York, obviously very rich. At that time, her gallery was known as the gallery for the 20th century, Art of This Century Gallery, it was called. It was the Art of This Century Gallery for a long time. I don't remember what date the name changed, but that became the Guggenheim. So the Guggenheim Museum at this time was called the Art of This Century, but it was still Peggy Guggenheim's museum. And because she was herself, in fact, at that time, she was married to Max Ernst. Max Ernst was married to quite a few people at different times, but briefly at this time, he was married to Peggy Guggenheim. Actually, he soon after that became married to Dorothea Tanning. So she was his wife really for all of the rest of his life then. So they were the ones that were together for the longest. In fact, they had a double wedding with Dorothea Tanning and Max Ernst, and Man Ray and his last wife, Juliet, had a double wedding in New York. So it was an interesting moment. And that's when, after that, they went out, because of her, they went out to Sonora Desert in northern Arizona and really lived the rest of their life there. Now, with most of the women surrealists, their work tended to be more personal. It often had to do with women and being a woman, but it was always much more personal than men's work. They used it as a way of sort of understanding things in general. She had just met Ernst, actually, when she did this one on the left. He's the one that suggested it be titled Birthday, 1942. The one on the right is her most famous, Eine kleine Nachtmusik, a little night music images. But again, it deals with these people, the little girls. Leonore Carrington. These women are quite well known, and they're getting a lot more attention today. Was born she's British. She was born in Britain. She actually, before he married Peggy Guggenheim, he lived with Leonore Carrington. So Max Ernst, gets around. So he was living for a number of years with Leonore Carrington. They got separated when the war broke out, because Max Ernst was in Paris when the war first broke out. He didn't get out quick enough. So he was a German living in Paris, and he was actually put into a camp for a while because he was a foreign national. He was an enemy, but he was only in there a few months, and then he left and came to New York. She got caught in Spain at the time of the war, and they really never got back together again. And then he came over here and married Peggy Guggenheim. She actually ended up in an institution for a number of years in Spain, a psychiatric institution, suffering from extreme emotional distress. Whatever that means, but she and Ernst never got together again. After that, she eventually made her way to Mexico, and Mexico City was a huge center for the arts in the 30s, in this interwar period. Especially surrealism. There were a lot of surrealists in Mexico City. They had their own whole group, and we'll look at someone else from there in just a moment. So she was very successful. She had major shows in New York in 1948 at major galleries. Several of them showed at the Pierre Matisse Gallery. During this period, there are two major galleries in New York that showed sort of cutting edge art and were really open to the surrealists. One was Eugene Levy Gallery, and the Pierre Matisse Gallery. And Pierre Matisse was the son of Henri Matisse, who was really an American by that time, but it really was a very, very important art center. To get into the Pierre Matisse Gallery was a very important one. Kay Sage, Kay Sage's story is a little sadder in many ways, at least late in her life. She's from Connecticut, another American, and she again went to art school. She's formal education. She went to the Corcoran School of Art. So she, had major art education. She was married to an Italian prince for a while and lived in Rome. But then when she didn't paint during that period. He was like this important prince, and her duty was, to be hostess and, all this stuff. So when that broke up, then she went to Paris and really started getting involved with Surrealists again and started showing there. She met Breton, she met another Surrealist painter, Yves Tanguy, and we have a nice little Tanguy in the Nelson Gallery, by the way, and it looks very much like her work. They're almost identical in their works. So she was married to Yves Tanguy then at that point. But, they came back to New York as well during the war, and she showed at Pierre Matisse. So they were all successful. These are women who were very successful women, even though they were in the past left out of the literature. The men didn't include them in the, all the manifesto writing and all of this sort of stuff. They weren't part of the circle, but nevertheless, they were very successful women. And have to include Leonore Fini, who was a very successful woman. She is Argentine and Italian, born in Buenos Aires, but raised in Italy. Her work has a lot of eroticism in it. We haven't seen a lot of it, but a great deal of surrealist imagery has a lot of eroticism in it, a lot of sexuality. I mean, if you're going to tap into your subconscious mind, you're going to get some of that. And, a lot of Freud was rooted in sexuality. Leonore Fini was scandalous in Paris at the time. She cross-dressed, she wore men's clothes, she had relationships with women. She was very much sort of out there in the public. That was still pretty scandalous in the 30s, even in art circles. Also, she had apparently 23 cats. And there are various reasons why she was sort of a scandalous person, but a very successful artist. This is one of her many portraits. She has a lot of portraits, self-portraits. The women do a lot of self-portraits, more than the men do by any means, but nevertheless tapping into it. The other notable thing about her is that she was the costume designer for Fellini's film 8½, which is one of the most famous films of the 20th century ever made. So now I want to go back and watch it again and see her costumes and think about that.
Who was Nico?
We don't
We don't know. Just
one of her lovers, some person.
names,
She had relationships with all sorts of different people. No, I don't know who Nico was, but that's her self-portrait. And I love that photograph of her. The most famous of the women surrealists was Frida Kahlo, and she was at the heart of this Mexican center. And it was partially because of her, it just became a refuge. It was another place to go. And there were quite a few surrealists there. The most important person that was there was Trotsky. When Trotsky had to flee from Russia, he went to Mexico City. He was a huge supporter of surrealism, even before he left Russia. But he was in Mexico City when he was assassinated. There are rumors that he had a relationship with Frida Kahlo. Nobody knows, but anything's possible. This is her, of course, with her husband, Diego Rivera, who always overshadowed her. He was this huge personality that got all the spotlight and apparently sucked up all of the energy that existed. She divorced him and then married him again. So their relationship was very, very tumultuous, constantly. And then her life, of course, if you know anything about Frida Kahlo, is really framed by her own medical conditions. She had polio when she was a child. She had one leg that was very much smaller. She eventually lost that leg. And then after she was an adult, she was in a bus accident, and a pole from the bus pierced her body. And she had probably 30 surgeries. She ended up sort of in a wheelchair. She lost a leg. She was in constant pain. Her life was centered around the physicality of her body. And you see that in her work. You see that relationship to her body and her relationship with Diego. The other thing is she was part Mexican, Indian, Native American, and also part Hungarian Jew. Her father was a Hungarian Jew. So she also had her feet in two different cultures, two different realms. And she always struggled to identify who she was in this mix. And paintings like this, I mean, just tell her life story. I mean, they just do. Two Fridas. On the left, you have her in sort of a traditional, it's actually a traditional Mexican wedding dress. It's a type of dress from one region in Mexico. And then the one on the right is sort of more westernized clothing. Her heart is exposed. She's bleeding, these sort of vein-like forms. It speaks to someone obsessed with their culture and their place in culture, and also someone whose body is dictating their relationship to the world, as she sort of holds her own hand. Something like The Dream, which is also really quite well known. She was known to actually sleep next to an actual paper mache skeleton in her bed sometimes. And so here now it's a dream. These things, these paper mache skeletons were associated with Judas, and at Easter they would be burned, like you're burning Judas. In this case, she has him wrapped with bombs, TNT, but it seems to also reference death. Images of death like this have a powerful place in Mexican imagery. It's like the Day of the Dead, which is a different thing, and then this. So that imagery plays into it. The bed is floating. The greenery is around her as she's sort of tiny in this oversized bed. And it's like it's hovering over her. And then, it's holding this bouquet, don't have 100% answer for it. But again, it is very much her. It's more her than you would see in, say, a Dali or a Max Ernst, who aren't sort of opening up their souls in a way that she is. The broken column. I love this because of the reference to the column. Again, the title changes everything. Clearly it's relating to her physical condition, that those straps are a back brace that she had to wear. And apparently it was fairly uncomfortable to have to do. She actually learned to paint from her bed. Beds appear in a lot of her work because she spent a lot of her life in bed, actually painting while she was in bed. But in this case, constant pain, the exposed column. We've seen another reference earlier to a column. It was a little sculptural piece by Nam Gabo, the Russian sculptor. It was called Column, and it was a plastic thing. And I talked about it, the title, and how the classical column, which this is, a sort of classical Greek column, has all sorts of associations in the art world with a whole culture dedicated to art and tradition. And it becomes almost as much a symbol of a traditional art world as the Mona Lisa did. In a way, it's an image that has a lot to go with it. And in this case, she's weeping over that. She's speaking about her relationship to her art, her inability to make her art. I do want to, actually, before I do this, I wanted to go back to Kay Sage, because I did reference once tragedy. Tragedy in her life is that as she got older, and Tanguy died actually fairly young, like in the 50s. Many of the others surrealists lived into the 70s, Max Ernst did, but her husband died fairly young, and she got cataracts, and she started going blind. And it made me really, really stop and think about how grateful we should be to it. Cataracts were almost like a death sentence. You went blind. There was no cataract surgery. I mean, I've had cataract surgery, just this, and I know a lot of people that have had, it's not that uncommon, but what if it were just telling you, okay, you're going blind, that's it. How many people that just I know that would be completely blind? It made me really stop and think.
It was
Not, I don't remember the date, but a lot of the last years, the decades of her life was a slow process of going blind. And she actually attempted suicide once because she's an artist. But that's the biggest fear in the world if you're an artist, is that you go blind. You could lose your hearing and still make art, but you're blind. That's, you know, your vision is everything. And so this was really hard for her. If there'd only been cataract surgery. Okay, so just very, very quickly, a couple pieces. Surrealism had a wide influence, just like constructivism had a wide influence for artists who really were not part of the group at all. Everybody in the 30s, or a lot of people in the 30s, was impacted. Picasso certainly was. All of his work from this period is directly related to surrealism. The mirror is not only the forms, the sort of organic sort of forms that you saw surrealists working with, but just the idea of, you know, looking into the mirrors were common symbols in surrealist art. They symbolize another world, you know, stepping through the looking glass. It's like surreality is on the other side of the mirror, and the dream. I mean, the two ideas that are deeply rooted in surrealism, but the sort of liquid-like forms. You know, Freud said that water is the ultimate symbol of the subconscious mind. So if you dream you're floating in water, whatever, that's your subconscious mind. You're trying to tap your subconscious mind. So, you know, and of course the surrealists all read that. So, you know, then these liquid-like forms have sort of, in their own right, are associated with the subconscious mind, like you're sort of melting into that other reality. So you really see it in Guernica, which we didn't look at with Picasso, which of course he painted in 1937, relating to the Spanish Civil War against Franco for independence. Guernica directly taps into the sort of horror imagery of surrealism. It's sort of the nightmare of war and terror. And you see that as the forms are sort of that idea of a metamorphosing, something's going through a metamorphosis. I mean, that's what Dali often did, but his forms are often sort of metamorphoses. And when you look at the imagery, you see it as well, this sort of shifting reality and the melting forms and the screaming voices. This is very, very influenced by surrealism, and he used it in a way that very much, I think, enhanced the scene and gave it the horror that he wanted it to have. That's all I have for today, so I would be happy to hear if there are any questions anyone has.
You mentioned reading books on artificial intelligence and whether or not we're living in reality. Can you say more on that? I don't want to interrupt while you were talking. But
I wish I could remember the names. I just got the books. I can give you one guy's name. It's Nick something, and I can't remember his last name, but I'll try and remember to write that down or send out an email or something.
Coming from the Matrix.
That is certainly something that triggered, that's when it began. Yeah, that the Matrix began, people saying, well, how do we know? And then philosophers seriously got involved and started, you know, doing these logical calculations. And philosophy is interesting because you could do all kinds of bizarre things in philosophy, and they don't necessarily have to be true or relate to anything. And so I hate to go into this because I'm not an expert on this and don't know what I'm talking about, but they've calculated it down to, you know, premises like if this were true, and if that were true, and if that were true, then there's a 95% chance we're living in a computer simulation. But, you know, you got to go back to the if this was true and if that was true. So it's an interesting, I enjoy the thought process of it, but there was the story I was referring to is there was a young man a few years ago who had mental problems and got caught up in all this. It's different when real philosophers are talking about it. It becomes intellectualized, but there are also a lot of kooky people on the internet talking about it in actually believing it, which is a whole different thing. And he was already mentally disturbed and decided that he was living in a computer simulation and that nothing mattered. And he was one of those school shooters. And just went in and started killing everybody because it didn't matter. You would just be reset, right? You'd just be reset and the game would reset. That, any other questions or anything, people?
I recommend a book by Freud. I mean, I read about him, but I've never read anything that he wrote.
Freud's very readable, easily readable.
Help me out.
Well, I would start with Interpretation of Dreams. It's his most famous. There are lots of others. But because he was inventing this new science, he wasn't writing to like a bunch of specialists. He was writing to people who didn't know anything about it. So he writes it in a very sort of easily understandable way. You know, later psychology is written much more complexly because they're writing for their own peers, but he didn't have any peers when he wrote that. So I find his work really easily readable. Okay, everybody. Well, I'll see you in 2 weeks then. Take care.